The widow removed the chains from a wild black cow. By sunrise, strange riders appeared. A sound cuts through the dark first. Not a howl, not a bark, something lower, something wounded, dragging itself across 200 acres of fog until it reaches a farmhouse porch where a woman has not slept a full night in over a year. She is already standing at the window before she understands why. Somewhere past the tree line, something massive is in pain, and before the sun rises over the hills of Montana, that pain will bring strangers to her gate on horseback, men with old debts and older secrets, men who believe a chain can bury the truth forever. It cannot. If you are watching this from a town small enough that everyone remembers whose father owed whose grandfather money, you already understand what is coming. Before this story unfolds, drop the name of your city in the comments. Tell this channel whether you have ever kept a secret to protect land that was never really yours to protect. And if you believe some debts should never be paid, hit subscribe and stay close. This is the story of a woman who broke the wrong chains for the right reasons, and the reckoning that followed her into the light. Her name is Avalini Ashworth, and for 14 months she has lived inside a house that remembers a man who is no longer in it. The farmhouse sits at the end of a gravel road that the county stopped maintaining 2 winters ago, its boards silvered by weather, its porch sagging in the middle like a spine that has carried too much for too long. Barbed wire runs the perimeter of the property in uneven lines, rust bleeding down the posts in long orange tears. Fog gathers low in the pasture most mornings, thick enough that the cattle Avalini no longer owns would have vanished into it entirely, had there been cattle left to vanish. There are not. There is only Avalini, a barn with 3 empty stalls, a rooster that crows at the wrong hour out of spite, and the silence that moves through all of it like something with a heartbeat. She was not born to this land. She married into it, and into the man who built the fences with his own hands, Elias Ashworth, a rancher with a slow laugh and a slower temper, the kind of man neighbors trusted with their tools and their secrets in equal measure. For 6 years the farm thrived under him, and Avalini learned the rhythms of it the way she once learned the rhythms of a classroom before she left teaching behind, memorizing the sound of rain on tin, the particular creak that meant a gate needed oiling, the exact shade the sky turned before a storm broke. Then Elias got sick. It was slow, the kind of sickness that takes 18 months to finish what it starts, that empties a house one small capacity at a time. First his stamina, then his appetite, then his voice, then everything else. Avalini nursed him through all of it without complaint, without rest, without asking anyone for help she was too proud to need. By the end, she was rising at 4 to feed the animals, spending her mornings changing linens and crushing pills into applesauce, her afternoons on the phone with debt collectors her husband had never told her about, her nights sitting in a hard chair beside a bed that no longer held the man she married, only the shape of him. On the night he died, she had fallen asleep in that chair. She has never forgiven herself for the 15 minutes she was unconscious. She does not know if he called for her. She does not know if he was afraid. She only knows that when she woke, his hand had already gone cold in hers, and no amount of reasoning has managed to convince the part of her that keeps score that exhaustion is not the same as abandonment. Since that night, Avalini has lived like a woman serving a sentence she assigned herself, selling off the herd piece by piece to survive, letting the fields go fallow, letting the farmhouse quiet around her the way a mouth goes quiet around a wound it is afraid to reopen. The debt did not die with Elias. It came due in the name of a man named Cormac Doyle, who holds more paper on more failing ranches in this county than anyone cares to admit, and who has been patient with Avalini in the specific, watchful way that patient men are patient when they expect eventually to collect. He has not pressed her. Not yet. He sends word through his riders twice a season, a reminder wrapped in courtesy, the kind of courtesy that has teeth underneath it if you know where to look. Avalini knows where to look. She has learned to read men the way she once read weather. Tonight, the fog is thicker than usual, curling low over the dead grass, swallowing the fence line whole. Avalini sits at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold an hour ago, staring at a ledger of numbers that do not improve no matter how long she stares. The house creaks around her, settling into the cold the way it always does after midnight. She has grown used to being the only living thing awake inside these walls. That is when the sound reaches her. It is faint at first, carried strangely by the fog, a low, guttural moan that could be whined through a broken pipe, could be an animal, could be nothing at all. She sets down her pen. She waits, the way a person waits for a second knock before deciding the first one was real. It comes again, longer this time, unmistakably alive, unmistakably in pain, rolling across the dark pasture from somewhere near the property's northern edge, where her land meets the tangled scrub of unclaimed hill country that no one has fenced properly in a generation. She should not go out there. She knows this the way she knows most things now, distantly, as a fact that no longer has any authority over her. She pulls on her husband's old coat, the one still hanging by the door because she has not been able to move it, and she takes the lantern from the hook, and she takes, without entirely deciding to, the heavy pair of fencing pliers from the toolbox by the porch steps. The walk to the northern fence line takes 11 minutes in the dark, 11 minutes of fog swallowing the lantern light 2 feet in front of her boots, 11 minutes of that sound growing louder, more ragged, more clearly an animal in distress, and not the wind at all. When she reaches the old dead oak that has stood at the property's edge since before Elias's grandfather owned this land, she stops walking entirely. The lantern light finds it first as a shape, enormous and black against the black of the tree, and then as something worse. A cow. Not one of the lean, docile Herefords that used to graze her pastures, but something larger, wilder, its coat matted with mud and blood, its eyes rolling white in the lantern light, with an animal terror that makes Avellini's own chest tighten in recognition. Heavy iron chains wrapped twice around its neck and twice around its foreleg, bolted to the trunk of the dead oak with a crudeness that suggests whoever did this was not concerned with the animal surviving the effort. The chain has cut through hide and into muscle in more than one place. The ground beneath the animal is torn to mud from thrashing, and there is no water within reach, no food, nothing but rusted iron and rot, and the slow arithmetic of an animal dying by inches, alone, in the dark, on land that is not even Avellini's to claim. She stands there a long moment, lantern trembling slightly in her grip, and something in her face shifts, the particular stillness of a woman recognizing her own reflection in a stranger's suffering. The cow's eye finds her. It does not startle further. It simply watches her the way something watches when it has nothing left to lose by watching. And in that raw, unblinking stare, Avellini sees something she has not let herself feel in 14 months. Not grief exactly, not guilt exactly, but the unbearable, familiar weight of watching someone suffer and being powerless to stop it in time. She was too late once already. She sets down the lantern. She kneels in the mud, close enough now to smell the copper of the wound and the animal's ragged breath, and she does not speak to it the way people speak to frightened animals in stories. No soft words, no promises. She simply reaches for the chain with the pliers, hands shaking, and begins to work. It takes nearly 40 minutes. The chain fights her, rusted joints seized by weather and time, and twice the animal thrashes hard enough to send her sprawling backward into the mud, once catching her shoulder with enough force to leave a bruise that will still be dark a week later. She does not stop. She works link by link, her palms tearing open against the iron, blood from her own hands mixing with the animal's on the metal, until finally, with a groan of old iron finally giving way, the last link snaps, and the chain falls slack into the mud. The cow does not run. For a long moment it simply stands there, trembling, freed but not yet believing it, and then it lowers its massive head and presses its bloodied muzzle briefly against Avellini's shoulder, a gesture too deliberate to be accident, before turning and limping unsteadily toward the farmhouse lights glowing faint through the fog behind her. Avellini stays kneeling in the mud a moment longer, staring at the broken chain coiled at her feet like something dead. She does not yet know that by morning, this small, private act of mercy will have summoned men on horseback to her gate, men who will call the animal cursed, who will call her a thief, who will threaten to take everything Elias ever built. She does not know yet that the chain in the mud was never meant to hold a wild animal at all. She only knows, kneeling there with her hands torn open in the dark, that for the first time in 14 months, she has done something instead of simply enduring. She rises. She picks up the lantern. She follows the cow home through the fog, and neither of them looks back. By the time Avellini reaches the farmhouse, the animal is already waiting on the porch, standing in the exact spot where Elias used to sit with his coffee every morning before the sickness took the mornings from him too. It has not gone to the barn. It has not gone to the empty pasture. It stands sentinel at the foot of the steps, head lowered, blood drying dark against its foreleg, watching the tree line the way a dog watches a door. Avellini does not sleep that night. She sits at the kitchen table with the lantern still burning, listening to the animal shift its weight on the porch boards outside, and for the first time in longer than she can name, the silence of the house does not feel entirely like punishment. She names it before dawn, without deciding to, the way names sometimes arrive on their own. Midnight, for the black of its coat, for the hour she found it, for something in its eyes that reminds her of the hours she has spent awake in this house since Elias died, hours with no morning in them at all. She does not know where midnight came from. There is no brand visible beneath the mud and blood, no tag, no clue to an owner who might come looking. She tells herself this is simply an animal that wandered off some distant ranch and was cruelly abandoned by whoever caught it, and she tells herself this because the alternative, that someone chained a living creature to a dead tree deliberately, on the edge of her own land, and meant for it to die there quietly where no one would ask questions, is not a thought she is ready to sit with yet. She should be. By first light, she has cleaned the wounds as best she can with what remains of Elias's old veterinary supplies, wrapping the worst of the gashes with strips of clean cloth, and she has hauled water to the trough by hand since the well pump has not worked reliably in months. Midnight drinks like something that has not trusted water in a long time, watching Avellini over the rim of the trough the entire time, and there is something unbearably human in the way it watches her, some current of shared exhaustion passing between them that neither can name and neither needs to. The fog begins to lift around 6. That is when Avellini hears the horses. She straightens at the sound before she consciously registers it, some old instinct in her body recognizing the particular rhythm of hooves on gravel long before her mind catches up. There are more than one. There are several. She moves to the porch rail and watches the tree line at the end of her drive, and out of the thinning fog they emerge like something conjured rather than arrived, for riders on horseback moving at an unhurried pace that is somehow more unsettling than urgency would be, the kind of pace that belongs to men who know they don't need to hurry because they already believe they've won. At the front of them rides Cormac Doyle, a broad man in his 50s whose face has the weathered calm of someone who has spent a lifetime being the most powerful person in every room he enters, and who has never once had to raise his voice to prove it. Beside him rides a younger man, thinner, more nervous in the saddle, glancing toward the farmhouse with an expression that does not match the confidence of the men around him. Behind them, 2 more riders Avellini does not recognize, their faces set into the practiced blankness of hired men who have learned not to ask questions about the jobs they're paid to do. Midnight, standing at the base of the porch steps, goes rigid the moment the riders come into view. A low sound builds in its chest, not quite a bellow, something closer to a warning, and it does not retreat toward the barn the way a frightened animal should. It plants itself between the approaching riders and the porch steps, between them and Avellini, for hooves set wide in the mud, head lowered, and holds its ground. Cormac reins his horse to a stop at the edge of the yard, close enough that Avellini can see the particular stillness in his eyes, a man calculating, always calculating, even when his voice comes out easy and warm. "Morning," he says, tipping his hat with a courtesy that does not reach his eyes. "Heard some commotion out this way last night. Thought I'd come see for myself." Avellini says nothing. She has learned, in 14 months of debt collectors and casserole-bearing neighbors who wanted to see the widow up close, that silence buys more time than words do. Cormac's gaze moves past her to the animal standing sentinel on the steps, and something shifts behind his eyes, brief, controlled, but there, a flicker of recognition that he smooths over almost before it surfaces. He dismounts slowly, unhurried, the way a man moves when he wants the world to believe he has all the time it could ever need. "That animal belongs to the estate," he says. "Ashworth's estate, which, as I recall, still carries paper in my name." Avellini's hand tightens on the porch rail. "It's not branded," she says. "It's not tagged. It's not anyone's." Cormac's mouth curves into something that isn't quite a smile. "Everything on this property is collateral until that paper's settled, Mrs. Ashworth. You know that better than most." Behind him, The younger rider shifts uncomfortably in his saddle, eyes flicking between Cormac and the animal with an expression Avellini cannot yet read, something caught between duty and doubt. She will not understand the significance of that look for weeks. Right now, it is only a small crack in the otherwise unified wall of men on horseback, a crack she does not yet know to watch. That animal is dangerous, Cormac continues, his voice dropping into something almost gentle, almost concerned. Wild stock like that, it's been causing trouble across 3 ranches this season. Sick, some say. You'd be doing yourself a favor letting us take it off your hands before it does you harm. Midnight's low warning sound rises in volume, and one of the horses shies back a step. Avellini does not move from the rail. Something in her posture has changed since the riders arrived. Some old rigidity returning to her spine that has not been there in 14 months of grief-softened days. It stays here, she says. Cormac studies her for a long moment, and the warmth drains slowly from his expression, replaced by something colder, more patient, more dangerous for its patience. He does not argue. He does not raise his voice. He simply resettles his hat, turns back toward his horse, and pauses with one boot in the stirrup. We'll be back, Mrs. Ashworth, he says, not turning around. With the counsel, and with the paper. You might want to think real hard about what that animal's worth to you, next to everything else you stand to lose. The riders turn and disappear back into the thinning fog the way they came. Unhurried, certain, and Avellini stands alone on her porch with a wild, wounded animal pressed protectively against her legs, watching the tree line long after the sound of hooves has faded entirely into silence. Somewhere behind Cormac's calm threat is a fear she has not yet learned to name, and somewhere in the way Midnight refused to run, refused even to flinch, is a loyalty Avellini has not earned yet and does not understand. She will understand both before this is over. Neither understanding will come cheap. The days that follow settle into an uneasy rhythm, the kind of quiet that exists only in the space before a storm makes up its mind. Midnight does not leave the farmyard. It grazes the overgrown pasture nearest the house, drinks from the trough Avellini refills twice daily, and each night positions itself at the base of the porch steps, like something standing guard over a door it has decided, without being asked, belongs to it now. Avellini finds herself talking to the animal in the way lonely people talk to creatures who cannot judge them for it. Not confessions exactly, but fragments, the small unspoken debris of a life lived mostly in silence. She tells it about the sound of Elias's laugh, how it used to fill the whole downstairs of the house, even from the barn. She tells it, without quite meaning to, about the 15 minutes she was asleep. She does not tell it, because she has not yet told herself that some part of her chose to sit in that chair every night not out of exhaustion alone, but because staying awake meant staying present for an ending she could not bear to witness with her eyes open the whole time. Midnight listens the way animals listen, with stillness and weight, and something in that stillness begins, slowly, to loosen a grip inside Avellini that 14 months of solitude never managed to touch. She is not foolish enough to believe this peace will last. She spends her days reinforcing the fence nearest the northern property line, repairing the sections closest to the dead oak where she found the chains still coiled in the mud, evidence of something she has still not let herself examine too closely. She spends her nights with the shotgun her husband kept behind the pantry door propped within reach, though she has not decided, even to herself, whether she would ever use it. The council arrives on the 4th morning. Word of Cormac's visit has clearly traveled through the valley the way word always travels in places small enough that everyone's business belongs to everyone, and the delegation that rolls up Avellini's gravel drive in a convoy of trucks is larger than the 4 riders who came before, 7 men this time, ranchers and landowners whose families have run cattle in these hills for generations, men whose faces Avellini recognizes from church pews and county fairs and the funeral that put her in this house alone in the first place. At the center of them stands Otis Renner, the council's aging chairman, a man whose reputation for fairness has curdled slightly over the years into something closer to convenient neutrality, always careful to land on whichever side keeps the peace among the county's most powerful ranchers. We've had reports, Otis says without preamble, standing at the base of her porch steps with his hat in his hands in a show of respect that does not extend to his tone. Contamination. Sickness moving through 3 separate herds this season. Cattle going down with something nobody can name yet. And now there's talk of a wild animal appearing out of nowhere, right around the same time, right here on your land. Avellini's jaw tightens. That's not what happened. Otis's eyes flick briefly toward Midnight, standing rigid at the top of the steps, before returning to Avellini's face. We're not accusing you of anything, Mrs. Ashworth. We're asking for cooperation. The state veterinarian will need to examine the animal. If it tests clean, that's an end to it. And if you don't wait for the vet, Avellini says. If you just take it now. The silence that follows answers the question more honestly than any of the men gathered in her yard are willing to. It is Cormac, standing slightly apart from the council delegation with his arms crossed, who finally breaks it. This doesn't have to be difficult, he says, his voice carrying the same practiced warmth from 4 days before. You hand the animal over voluntarily, cooperate with the council's investigation, and I'm prepared to speak to the bank about restructuring what's owed on this property. Maybe forgiving a good piece of it outright. Man to man, considering the circumstances. There it is, laid bare in the open air between them. The offer Avellini has known was coming since the moment Cormac's eyes flickered with recognition at the sight of Midnight on her porch steps. Everything she has been slowly losing since Elias died, the land, the house, the last threads of the life he built, could be saved with a single act of surrender. All she has to do is stop protecting an animal that isn't even hers, that showed up out of the fog 4 nights ago carrying wounds someone else inflicted, that has no more legal claim to her loyalty than a stray dog would. She looks at Midnight. The animal is watching her the way it watched her that first night in the mud, that same raw, unblinking recognition, and something in Avellini's chest that has been frozen since the night her husband died begins, for the first time, to move. I found that animal chained to a dead tree, half dead itself, she says, her voice steady in a way that surprises even her. Nobody reported it missing. Nobody came looking for it before you all showed up asking to take it away. You want to test it for sickness, fine. Bring your vet. But it stays on my land until then, and it doesn't leave with anyone who won't say where those chains came from. The words land in the yard like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward through the gathered men. Cormac's expression does not change, but something behind his eyes goes flat and cold in a way that makes the younger rider beside him take an involuntary half-step back. Otis clears his throat, uncomfortable, caught between 2 men, 2 women, 2 forces he would clearly prefer not to be standing between at all. We'll arrange for the veterinarian, he says finally, within the week. Until then, Mrs. Ashworth, I'd advise you to think carefully about who you're choosing to stand against. The council disperses back to their trucks, engines rumbling to life one by one, kicking dust into the cold morning air. Cormac is the last to leave, lingering at the gate long enough to look back at Avellini one final time. And what passes across his face in that moment is not quite anger, not quite disappointment, but something closer to the look of a man recalculating an equation he had believed was already solved. You're making a mistake, he says, quiet enough that only she can hear it. Maybe, Avellini answers. But it's mine to make. He holds her gaze a moment longer, then turns and walks to his truck without another word, and the convoy disappears down the gravel road the same way the riders did 4 mornings before, leaving Avellini alone in the yard with a wild black cow, a fence line still not fully repaired, and a debt that will now almost certainly come due in full. She does not regret the words even as their weight settles over her. What she feels instead, standing in the settling dust with Midnight pressed warm against her side, is something she has not felt since long before Elias got sick, something dangerously close to conviction. It will not go unpunished. The retaliation begins 2 days later, quiet at first, the way most punishment in a small community begins, not with violence, but with absence. Avellini wakes to find the communal irrigation line that feeds her northern pasture has been shut off at the shared valve, the one maintained collectively by 5 neighboring properties under an agreement older than her marriage to Elias. No note, no explanation, just dry earth where water should be running. And when she drives into town for supplies that afternoon, she finds the same quiet absence waiting for her there too. Conversation stopping when she enters the feed store, eyes sliding away from hers at the counter. The particular silence of a community that has collectively decided, without a single public word, which side of a dispute it intends to stand on. She understands, with a clarity that settles cold in her stomach, that Cormac did not need to threaten her directly. He only needed to make his displeasure known, and the rest of the county did the calculating on its own, weighing an outsider widow and her unclaimed wild animal against a man who holds paper on half the ranches in the valley. Debts, favors, the long, quiet arithmetic of small-town survival, and Avellini has just made herself the wrong side of the equation. By the end of the week, a legal notice arrives, taped to her gate rather than delivered by hand, a formal filing citing breach of the estate's outstanding obligations and giving her 30 days to satisfy the debt in full or vacate the property. The paper is dense with language designed to intimidate more than inform, and Avellini reads it twice on the porch steps with Midnight's head resting heavy against her shoulder, and she does not cry, though something in her throat aches with the effort of not doing so. The pasture without water begins to show the strain within days, grass browning at the edges, the ground cracking in thin fissures beneath the relentless dry heat of a Montana summer, refusing to loosen its grip. Avellini hauls water from the house well by hand, bucket by bucket, a task that takes hours and leaves her hands blistered and her back screaming by nightfall. But it is not enough, not for a pasture of that size, and she knows with grim certainty that within 2 weeks the northern grazing land will be unusable entirely. It is Midnight who finds the way through. On the 11th day since the county cut her water, Avellini notices the animal has stopped grazing the browning pasture nearest the house and has instead wandered further than it ever has before, toward the wooded rise at the property's far northern edge, an overgrown stretch of land Elias always meant to clear and never got around to before the sickness took his time from him too. Avellini follows out of some instinct she does not examine closely, calling the animal's name into the trees with a rope in hand in case it has decided, after all this time, to finally run. It has not run. She finds it standing in a small clearing choked with brush and fallen timber, pawing insistently at the ground near a cluster of moss-slick rocks. And it is only when Avellini gets close enough to see clearly that she understands what the animal has led her to. Water. A spring, hidden for decades beneath the overgrowth, bubbling clear and cold from a fissure in the rock, feeding a small basin before disappearing again into the earth, untouched, unclaimed, unknown to anyone, apparently, in the entire history of this property. Avellini stands frozen at the edge of the clearing for a long moment, staring at something that should not exist, that Elias himself, who walked every inch of this land 100 times over in his life, never once found. She kneels at the edge of the basin and cups her hands beneath the surface, and the water that fills them is cold and clean and utterly unlike anything running through the county's shared irrigation system. Unlike anything that could possibly carry whatever contamination has been sickening cattle 3 ranches over. Something settles in her chest as she stares at her own reflection rippling in the clear water, some understanding arriving before the words for it do. If this spring has been here all along, feeding the deep water table beneath her land independently of the county system entirely, then her property, her cattle, whatever cattle she might one day rebuild her herd with, could never have been the source of contamination the council is so eager to blame on an animal that appeared out of nowhere 4 nights ago. The timing Otis Renner found so suspicious was never suspicious at all. It was simply an unlucky coincidence dressed up by frightened men looking for somewhere convenient to point their fear. She spends the rest of the day and most of the following week clearing brush from the spring by hand, running new pipe from the basin down toward the house and the barn, a task that leaves her exhausted in a way that feels, for the first time in 14 months, productive rather than punishing. By the time she finishes, water flows clean and constant to both the house and what remains of the northern pasture, and the grass, given time, will recover. She does not yet understand the full weight of what she has found. She only understands that Midnight led her here deliberately, that the animal has now, twice, protected her in ways she has not asked for and cannot fully explain, and that some quiet, wordless debt is accumulating between them that has nothing to do with chains or paper or the council's threats at all. That night, sitting on the porch steps with the sound of running water audible now for the first time in her property's history, Avellini rests her hand against Midnight's flank and feels, beneath her palm, the steady rhythm of a heartbeat that 4 days ago the animal was not expected to survive to keep having. Somewhere out past the fence line, an owl calls once into the dark and falls silent, and for a long moment neither woman nor animal moves, both of them simply breathing in the particular stillness of a small, hard-won victory neither yet realizes is only the beginning of what this land is about to reveal. The state veterinarian arrives on a gray Thursday morning 9 days later, a slight, precise man named Bennett Sorrell who steps out of a county truck with a black case in one hand and an expression that suggests he would rather be almost anywhere else, caught as he clearly is between the council that summoned him and a woman whose reputation has apparently preceded her in every direction across the valley. He is not alone. Cormac has come too, along with Otis Renner and 2 other council members, and for the first time since the chains came off in the dark 11 days ago, Avellini finds herself facing the full weight of the men who intend to decide Midnight's fate in the cold light of a single examination. She does not step back from it. She stands at the fence line with her arms crossed, watching Bennett approach the animal with the wary respect of a man who has clearly been warned about its size and its temperament in equal measure, and something in her posture, some hard-won steadiness, seems to unsettle Cormac more than any argument could have. Midnight allows the examination with a stillness that surprises everyone present, standing rigid but calm as Bennett moves methodically through his work, checking eyes, gums, the healing wounds along its neck and foreleg where the chains once cut deep, drawing blood into small vials with practiced efficiency. Avellini watches his face throughout, searching for some flicker of concern or confirmation, but Bennett's expression remains carefully, professionally blank, the face of a man who has learned not to give away his findings before he's ready to speak them. It is nearly 40 minutes before he straightens, peeling off his gloves, and turns to address the small gathering waiting at the fence line with an expression that has shifted, subtly but unmistakably, into something closer to unease. No signs of the pathogen affecting the other herds, he says. Blood work will confirm in a few days, but visually, this animal is clean. Malnourished from whatever it endured before it got here. Wounds consistent with prolonged restraint by heavy chain, but no disease. Nothing contagious. Nothing that explains what's happening on the other properties. A ripple of unease moves through the council members gathered at the fence, and Cormac's jaw tightens almost imperceptibly, the first crack Avellini has seen in his composure since the morning he rode up her drive 4 mornings after the chains came off. But Bennett is not finished. He hesitates, glancing down at something in his notes, then back at the animal, running his hand along a patch of hide near its left flank where the coat has grown in slightly differently than the surrounding fur. A small, irregular patch easy to miss beneath matted black hair, unless a person is looking for it specifically, unless a person has spent 30 years examining livestock and knows precisely what an old, deliberately obscured brand looks like beneath scar tissue and regrowth. There's something else, he says slowly. This animal's been branded before. A long time ago, from the look of the scarring. Someone's tried to alter it since, burned over the original mark, but you can still make out part of the shape underneath if you know what you're looking at. The yard goes very still. Avellini feels something cold move through her chest, some instinct arriving a half-second before understanding does, and she watches Cormac's face in that stillness with an attention sharper than anything she has directed at him since this began. "Whose mark?" she asks, though some part of her already suspects the answer before Bennett speaks it aloud. Bennett crouches again, parting the fur carefully, tracing the faint raised scarring with one gloved finger, comparing it against something in his notes, a registry he has apparently brought precisely, because Otis Renner asked him to confirm ownership before anything else. When he looks up, his expression has changed entirely, the careful blankness replaced by something closer to genuine unease. "It's an old mark," he says, "registered decades back. 2 interlocking A's, from what I can make out beneath the burn-over. That's not a Doyle mark, and it's not registered to anyone currently active in this county's herd records." He pauses, flipping back a page in his notes, cross-referencing something, and when he speaks again his voice has dropped, careful now, aware suddenly of the weight of what he is about to say into a yard full of men who did not expect this particular truth to surface today. "The registry lists that mark under a ranch dissolved 11 years ago," he says. "Ashworth. Elias Ashworth." The silence that follows is total, the kind of silence that seems to swallow even the wind moving through the dry grass. And every eye in the yard turns first to Avellini, standing frozen at the fence line with her husband's name suddenly hanging in the cold morning air like something risen out of the ground itself. And then, inevitably, unavoidably, to Cormac Doyle. Avellini does not move. Something is assembling itself behind her eyes with terrible, quiet speed. 11 years of small confusions finally arranging themselves into a shape she has never let herself see clearly before. The animals Elias always swore had gone missing to predators in those first hard years of the ranch, before Avellini ever arrived to share the burden of it with him. The debts to Cormac Doyle that never quite made sense for a ranch that should have been solvent. Debts Elias always waved off when she asked. Debts he carried silently to his grave without ever once explaining their origin. The particular tightness that used to cross her husband's face whenever Cormac's name came up at the feed store or the county fair, a tightness she always mistook for simple rivalry between two ranchers competing for the same grazing contracts. It was never rivalry. Cormac's face has gone rigid, the practiced warmth entirely stripped away now, replaced by something harder, colder, calculating even now, even caught. That mark's old, he says, his voice carrying a defensiveness that betrays more than his words intend. Could mean anything. Could have been sold, traded, a dozen explanations. Then explain them, Avellini says, and her voice does not shake, does not rise, carries instead a terrible, quiet steadiness that seems to unsettle him far more than shouting ever could. Explain why a cow branded with my husband's mark 11 years ago turned up chained to a dead tree on the edge of my property, burned over to hide whose it really was. The same week you showed up demanding I hand it over before anyone could examine it too closely. Otis Renner is staring at Cormac now with an expression that has shifted entirely away from the careful neutrality he arrived with, and the other council members exchange glances heavy with a suspicion none of them seem eager to voice aloud in front of witnesses. Bennett Sorrell, still crouched beside the animal, looks between the assembled men with the particular discomfort of someone who has just realized his routine examination has uncovered something considerably larger than livestock disease. Cormac's eyes move once, briefly, involuntarily, toward the tree line at the northern edge of Avellini's property, toward the dead oak where the chains were found, and in that single flicker of a glance, brief as it is, Avellini sees the truth confirm itself completely, sees 11 years of quiet debt and unexplained losses finally resolve into the shape of a man who stole from a dying rancher's herd long before that rancher was ever dying at all, and who has spent every year since collecting on a debt he manufactured himself to cover the theft. You don't know what you're talking about, Cormac says, but the warmth is entirely gone from his voice now, replaced by something brittle and defensive that convinces no one standing in that yard, least of all himself. I know exactly what I'm talking about, Avellini answers. I found her chained to a dead tree, starving, bleeding, left to die quiet where nobody would come looking, because somebody was afraid of exactly what that vet just found under her coat. The wind moves through the dry grass. Midnight stands motionless beside Avellini, and for the first time since the chains came off 11 nights ago, the animal's presence in this yard feels less like protection and more like testimony, a living, breathing piece of evidence standing silent between a widow and the man who has spent a decade quietly profiting from a theft he believed no one would ever uncover. Otis Renner clears his throat into the heavy silence, his voice careful, formal, the voice of a man suddenly aware that the ground beneath this entire dispute has shifted violently beneath his feet. I think, he says slowly, we're going to need considerably more than a blood test before this council makes any further decisions. Cormac says nothing. He simply turns, walks back to his truck without another word, and drives away alone this time. No riders flanking him, no unhurried confidence in the set of his shoulders, and Avellini watches him go with her husband's stolen brand still burning behind her eyes, understanding now, with a clarity that arrives cold and total, that the fight she has been having was never really about a wild animal at all. The days following Bennett Sorrell's discovery unfold with the particular slowness of a small community forced to reckon publicly with a truth it would clearly have preferred to leave buried. The council opens a formal inquiry into the brand registry, a process that moves at the glacial pace of rural bureaucracy, but moves nonetheless, and word spreads through the valley faster than any official notice. carried the way news always travels in places small enough that gossip functions as its own form of justice. Avellini finds herself, for the first time since Elias's funeral, the subject of a different kind of attention entirely. The silence that met her in the feed store weeks ago begins, slowly, to shift into something else. Neighbors who once looked away now meeting her eyes with a wariness that has less to do with judgment and more to do with the uncomfortable recalculation of a community realizing it chose the wrong side of a dispute without bothering to ask enough questions first. Not everyone shifts easily. Some of the council members, deeply intertwined with Cormac's financial web through decades of shared debt and favor, resist the inquiry with a stubbornness that suggests self-preservation more than genuine doubt. Avellini receives no formal apology, no immediate reversal of the eviction notice still taped, weathering now to her gate. The wheels of consequence turn slowly even when the truth beneath them is no longer in question. It is Walt Kessler, an old ranch hand who worked for Elias in the years before Avellini arrived, and who has kept his distance from the farm since the funeral out of a grief he has never quite named, who finally comes forward with the piece that turns suspicion into certainty. He arrives at Avellini's gate on a cold morning 11 days after the veterinarian's visit, hat in hand, an old man carrying the particular discomfort of someone about to unburden a secret he has carried too long. He tells her, standing awkwardly in her yard with his eyes fixed mostly on the ground, about the years before she came into Elias's life, about a bad stretch when the ranch was young and struggling and Cormac Doyle, then a rising cattleman with more ambition than land, offered Elias a partnership on a breeding contract that seemed, at the time, like a lifeline. He tells her about cattle that started disappearing from the herd not long after, blamed on predators, on bad fences, on the ordinary bad luck that plagues every young ranch, and about a night Walt himself witnessed but never spoke of. Riders moving cattle off Ashworth land under cover of darkness, cattle that reappeared weeks later on Doyle land wearing altered brands. He tells her he said nothing because Elias asked him not to, because Elias was ashamed, because admitting he'd been robbed by a man he'd trusted felt, to a young rancher building his name in a small community, worse somehow than simply absorbing the loss and moving forward in silence. He tells her the debt Cormac has held over the estate for years was never a debt at all in the way everyone believed, but a fabricated ledger. Interest accumulated on a loan Elias was pressured into accepting to cover losses that were never really losses, only theft dressed up in paperwork. Avellini listens to all of it standing very still in her own yard, her husband's old coat pulled tight against the cold, and something in her chest that has been clenched shut for 14 months finally, slowly, begins to loosen, not into relief exactly, but into something closer to vindication laced with grief. The particular ache of finally understanding a silence she spent years married to without ever knowing its true shape. "Why now?" she asks Walt quietly. "Why tell me now?" The old man looks toward midnight, standing watchful at the porch steps the way she always does now, and something crosses his weathered face that might be shame or might simply be exhaustion. "Because that cow's wearing the same mark I watched them burn over 11 years ago," he says. "I told myself for a long time it wasn't my business to carry another man's shame for him. But watching you stand up to Cormac Doyle the way Elias never let himself do, I figured it was past time somebody carried it for you instead." He leaves her his written statement before he goes, a sworn account he agrees to give the council directly, and Avellini stands alone in her yard long after his truck disappears down the gravel road, holding the weight of 11 years of her husband's silence in her hands, understanding finally why he flinched at Cormac's name, why the debts never made sense, why some quiet grief always seemed to live beneath his laugh even in the years before the sickness took the laugh away entirely. She does not sleep well that night, not from fear this time, but from the particular restlessness of grief reshaping itself around a truth it did not expect to find. She sits on the porch steps in the cold with midnight's head heavy in her lap, running her torn, healing palms slowly along the animal's neck where the chain scars have begun, at last, to fade into smooth new hide, and she understands, sitting there in the dark, that the fight in front of her now is no longer only about protecting an animal that wandered out of the fog 11 nights ago. It is about finishing something her husband never let himself finish, about refusing to let his silence be the last word on what was taken from him. By sunrise, she has made her decision. She will not simply wait for the council's inquiry to grind slowly toward whatever conclusion its most compromised members can be persuaded to delay. She will force the truth into daylight herself, publicly, completely, in front of the entire valley, and she will do it before Cormac Doyle finds a way to bury it the way he buried the truth of that stolen cattle 11 years ago. The County Grange Hall has not held a gathering this large since Elias's funeral, and Avellini notices the parallel with a grim, private irony as she steps through its double doors 3 days later, Walt Kessler's sworn statement in one hand, Bennett Sorrell's veterinary findings in the other. The council convened the meeting reluctantly, pressured into it by the sheer weight of rumor moving through the valley faster than any of them could control, and now the hall is packed wall to wall with ranchers, neighbors, and the merely curious. All of them come to witness whatever reckoning is about to unfold between the widow Ashworth and the man who has quietly run this county's finances for a decade. Cormac sits near the front, flanked by a lawyer he has clearly hired in the days since the veterinarian's discovery, his composure rebuilt into something colder and more careful than the warm authority he wore the first morning he rode up Avellini's drive. He does not look at her as she enters. He stares instead at some fixed point on the far wall, jaw tight, the posture of a man rehearsing a defense he already suspects will not hold. Otis Renner calls the meeting to order with visible discomfort, and the proceedings that follow move with a formality that feels almost absurd given the size of the crowd pressed into folding chairs and lining the walls. Farmers and ranchers who have known both Avellini and Cormac for years, watching now with the particular hunger of a community finally about to learn the true shape of a secret it has lived beside, unknowing, for over a decade. Avellini speaks plainly when her turn comes, without theatrics, without raised voice, laying out the sequence of events with the same steady clarity she has carried since the morning Cormac first rode up her drive demanding the animal's return. She describes the chains, the dead oak, the wounds that nearly killed an innocent creature before she reached it in time. She describes Bennett Sorrell's discovery of the altered brand, reads aloud the registry confirmation he has since filed formally with the county. She calls Walt Kessler forward, and the old ranch hand, hat in hand once more, repeats before the full hall what he told Avellini in her yard days earlier, his voice shaking slightly, but not once wavering from the truth of it. The hall grows very quiet as Walt speaks, a silence thick with the particular discomfort of a community recognizing, collectively, that the version of events it accepted for over a decade was built on a foundation someone constructed deliberately to survive scrutiny it was never meant to face. When Cormac's lawyer rises to offer a rebuttal, his arguments land thin and unconvincing against the weight of sworn testimony and physical evidence stacked against them, and Avellini watches, from where she stands at the front of the hall, the particular unraveling of a man who has spent a decade believing his authority in this valley was unassailable. Watching now as it comes apart in real time before an audience of the very neighbors whose respect he built that authority upon. It is Otis Renner, finally, who delivers what amounts to the hall's verdict, his voice heavy with the particular weariness of a man forced to admit publicly that his own caution allowed an injustice to continue longer than it should have. The council rescinds the estate's outstanding debt to Cormac Doyle in full, citing evidence of fraudulent origin. The eviction notice is voided. A formal investigation into Doyle's broader financial dealings across the valley will proceed under county authority, an investigation that will, in the weeks that follow, uncover a pattern considerably larger than a single stolen herd 11 years old. Cormac does not wait for the hall to finish processing the ruling. He rises from his seat, face rigid, and walks out through the double doors without a word to anyone, his lawyer trailing awkwardly behind him, and the sound of his truck engine turning over outside carries into the hall's sudden, heavy silence like a door closing on something that will not open again the same way. Avellini stands at the front of the hall as the crowd slowly rises around her, neighbors approaching in twos and threes now, some offering quiet apologies for the silence they kept in the weeks before, some simply nodding at her with an expression that has finally, fully, shifted from suspicion into something closer to respect. She accepts none of it as vindication exactly. Something in her chest remains tender, grief and justice tangled together in a way that does not resolve simply because a room full of people has finally agreed on the truth. She thinks, standing there, of Elias's silence across 11 years of marriage, of a debt he carried alone because shame convinced him it was easier than the truth, and something in her understands, for the first time, that his silence was never really about weakness. It was about a wound he did not know how to speak aloud, the same way her own guilt over those 15 sleeping minutes has kept her locked inside a house of punishment for 14 months past his death. Two people, married for 6 years, both carrying wounds they never fully showed each other, both believing silence was safer than the risk of being truly seen. She drives home alone in the dark, the truck's headlights cutting narrow paths through the same fog that carried her out to a dying animal chained to a dead tree 3 weeks earlier. And when she pulls up the gravel drive, midnight is waiting exactly where she always waits now, standing sentinel at the base of the porch steps, watching the tree line the way she has every night since the chains came off. Avellini sits with her a long while before going inside, resting her forehead against the animal's broad, warm neck, and for the first time in 14 months, the tears that come are not entirely made of grief. The weeks that follow bring a slow, uneven kind of peace, the kind that does not arrive all at once but accumulates in small, quiet increments the way water gathers in a basin long hidden beneath overgrown brush. The council's broader investigation into Cormac Doyle's financial dealings widens considerably beyond the single stolen herd, uncovering a pattern of manufactured debts and quietly altered brands stretching back further than even Walt Kessler's testimony suggested, implicating him in losses suffered by at least 3 other small ranches across the valley over the years. He does not stay in the county to face what follows. By the time the state formally files charges, Cormac Doyle has already sold what remained of his holdings and left the valley entirely, and the man who once rode up Avellini's drive with the unhurried confidence of someone who never expected to lose becomes, within a season, little more than a cautionary story traded quietly at the feed store counter. Avellini does not feel triumphant watching it unfold from a distance. She feels, mostly, tired in the particular way that comes after carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally setting it down. The debt gone, the land secure. She spends the early weeks of that change season doing something she has not allowed herself in 14 months, walking the full perimeter of the property simply to look at it, to see what remains of what Elias built and what she might, slowly, rebuild in his absence. The spring midnight led her to becomes the foundation of that rebuilding. Avellini hires a contractor from the next county over, someone with no history in the valley's tangled web of old debts and older grudges, to properly channel the water down toward both the house and the long fallow pastures. And by midsummer the northern fields have greened again for the first time since before Elias got sick. Grass thick and healthy in a way the county's shared irrigation system never quite managed even in its better years. She does not rebuild the herd quickly. She starts small. 3 young Herefords bought at a fair price from a neighboring rancher who was among the first to offer her a genuine apology after the Grange Hall meeting, and she tends them with the same careful, unhurried attention she once gave the man dying slowly in her care, though this time the attention yields growth instead of loss. Calves born healthy the following spring. A barn filling again with the sounds of a working ranch instead of the hollow echo of empty stalls. Midnight remains at the center of all of it, no longer chained to anything, no longer guarded or wary the way she was in those first raw days after Avellini cut her free. She grazes freely across the full breadth of the property now, wanders occasionally into the tree line, and always returns by nightfall. And something in the animal's bearing has shifted over the months from the rigid, protective sentinel she was in those early weeks into something closer to simple belonging. An animal that has decided, in whatever quiet reasoning animals carry, that this particular patch of earth is home now and does not need defending quite so fiercely because no one is coming to take it away. Walt Kessler returns to work the ranch by early autumn, an old man finding purpose again in land he helped build decades ago, and his presence brings with it a kind of continuity Avellini did not know she needed. Someone who remembers Elias not as a grieving widow remembers a husband, but as a friend remembers a man in full, flawed and complicated and worth defending even 11 years after he was wronged. It is Walt who finally asks her, one evening in late autumn as they sit on the porch steps watching midnight graze the far pasture in the fading light, whether she intends to keep the animal permanently or whether, now that the truth of the old brand has been settled and the danger has passed, she has thought about what comes next for a wild cow that was never truly hers to keep. Avellini considers the question a long moment before answering, watching Midnight's dark shape move slowly against the gold of the dying light, and something in her chest settles into a certainty she has been building toward without quite naming it since the night she knelt in the mud with torn hands and a pair of old fencing pliers. She was never mine to keep, Avellini says finally, but she's not going anywhere she doesn't choose to go. I think that's the only kind of belonging worth having. Walt nods slowly, understanding something in the answer that reaches beyond the animal entirely, and neither of them speaks again for a long while. The two of them simply sitting together in the particular quiet of a ranch finally, after so long, beginning to heal. Winter arrives early that year, the first snow dusting the hills in late October, and Avellini finds herself, for the first time since Elias's death, looking forward to the coming cold rather than dreading the long, isolated months it once promised. The house no longer feels like a place she is serving a sentence inside. It feels, slowly, like a place she is living in again, the difference subtle but unmistakable in the small habits that have crept back into her days. Cooking meals she actually intends to finish, keeping the wood stove burning through the evening instead of retreating early to a bed she used to dread. Standing on the porch some mornings simply to watch the sunrise instead of avoiding the window where she once stood the night she heard Midnight's cries carried across the fog. She visits Elias's grave that winter for the first time in months, walking the short distance to the small cemetery plot at the edge of the property where he chose, years ago, to be buried on the land he loved rather than in the crowded county cemetery in town. She stands there a long while in the cold, the ground hard beneath her boots, and she tells him, quietly, what Walt confessed to her in the yard weeks earlier, about the stolen herd, about the debt built on theft rather than honest loss, about a truth he carried alone for 11 years because shame convinced him silence was safer than being seen in his failure. She tells him she understands now, in a way she could not have understood before Midnight wandered chained and dying out of the fog, that carrying a wound alone does not make a person weak, only human, and that the difference between his silence and her own 14 months of self-imposed punishment was never really a difference at all, only two versions of the same fear. The fear that if the people who loved them truly saw the worst of what they carried, that love might not survive the seeing. She tells him she broke the chain anyway. Not just the one wrapped around an animal's neck in the dark, but the one she wrapped around her own heart the night she woke 15 minutes too late to hold his hand while it was still warm. The wind moves through the bare branches above the small cemetery plot, and somewhere behind her, faint but constant, she can hear Midnight's low, familiar sound carrying across the pasture, patient, unhurried, waiting the way she always waits now, not out of fear anymore, but out of something closer to companionship. Avellini stands a moment longer at her husband's grave, and then she turns and walks back toward the house, back toward the animal waiting for her in the fading light, back toward a life she has finally, after everything, allowed herself to keep living. The final snow of that first healed winter falls quietly over the valley on a morning in early March, and Avellini wakes before dawn out of habit now rather than grief, moving through the dark house with the easy familiarity of someone no longer haunted by the silence inside it. She finds Midnight waiting on the porch the way she always waits, dusted white with fresh snow, breath rising in slow, patient clouds into the cold morning air, and together they stand a while in the quiet, watching the sun climb slow and gold over hills that no longer carry the particular menace they once did, back when strangers on horseback could appear out of the fog carrying threats disguised as courtesy. The dead is gone. The land is whole. The truth, once buried deliberately beneath rust and burned over hide, now lives openly in county records and in the memory of a valley that has, slowly, learned to see Avellini Ashworth not as a fragile widow to be pitied or a stubborn woman to be punished, but as someone who stood her ground when standing it cost her nearly everything, and was proven right for the standing. She has not forgotten what it cost. The community's silence in those early weeks left its own quiet scar, a wariness toward casual trust that Avellini suspects will linger longer than the physical wounds Midnight carried out of the fog that first night ever did. Some of the neighbors who turned away during the worst of it have never fully returned. Their apologies offered, but their friendship never quite rebuilt to what it might have been. Grief and injustice both leave marks that healing does not erase so much as it teaches a person to carry differently. But there is a new herd grazing the northern pasture now. Cattle born on land fed by a spring hidden for decades until a wild, wounded animal led a grieving woman straight to it in the dark. There is a barn no longer standing empty, a house no longer holding its breath, a woman standing on her own porch in the cold morning light with her hand resting easy against the neck of a creature she once cut free from chains meant to bury a truth 11 years old. She thinks, some mornings, about how close she came to walking past that sound in the fog entirely, to telling herself it was only the wind, to staying inside where it was safe and warm, and asking nothing of her that grief had not already asked 100 times over. She thinks about how easily an entire truth might have stayed buried forever beneath rusted chain, an altered brand, and a decade of practiced silence, if she had simply chosen, that night, to stay in her chair. She did not stay in her chair. She went out into the dark with an old pair of pliers and her husband's coat and a grief she did not yet know how to carry, and she broke something that was never hers to break. And in doing so, she found her own way back into a life she had, for 14 months, quietly decided she no longer deserved to keep living. Midnight shifts beside her on the porch, exhaling a long, warm breath into the cold March air, and somewhere out past the fence line, a hawk calls once against the pale morning sky and wheels away toward the hills. Avellini watches it go, and then she turns, and together they walk down the porch steps into the new day, out toward the pasture, out toward the herd, out toward whatever comes next on land that finally, after everything, belongs entirely and honestly to the people and creatures who chose to stay and fight for it. The chains that mattered were never the ones wrapped around an animal's neck in the dark. They were the ones a grieving man wrapped silently around his own shame, and the ones a grieving woman wrapped just as silently around her own heart, both of them believing, in their separate solitudes, that some wounds are meant to be carried alone. Avellini knows better now. She learned it kneeling in the mud on a foggy night in Montana, hands torn open, breaking iron with nothing but old pliers and a stubborn, wordless refusal to let one more suffering thing die quietly where no one was willing to look. The sunrise does not undo what the night has taken. It never has, not for Avellini, not for the animal who once wore another man's crime burned into her hide, not for a valley that spent a decade looking away from a truth standing right in its own pastures. But sunrise comes anyway, every morning, whether it is earned or not, and it carries with it the chance, however small, however hard one, to finally stop hiding from what the dark revealed. Avellini Ashworth chose that chance. She is still choosing it, every morning, one sunrise at a time, and the wild black cow who refused to run walks beside her still, out across pastures that remember, now, only water and grass and the particular, unhurried peace of chains finally, rightfully, broken.